I agreed to go camping with my boss, John, thinking it might help build a better relationship outside of work. I wasn't thrilled about it, but it felt like I couldn't say no. He picked a spot about 3 hours from the city, far from any trails or campgrounds. He said he wanted to be totally alone for a real nature experience. By the time we got there, it was getting dark. The woods felt thick, almost like the trees were closing in, and it was dead quiet. The silence made me nervous. I pushed it aside and focused on setting up camp, trying to act like I knew what I was doing. John seemed like he had done this a bunch of times. He moved quickly, getting the fire going and setting out our supplies. But there was something weird about him. He was quieter than normal, not saying much except for a few grunts as he worked. His eyes seemed distant, like his mind was somewhere else. I told myself he was just stressed and tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping over me. By the time we finished setting up, it was pitch black outside. The only light came from our small fire, casting long, moving shadows on the trees. We ate fast, but John still didn't talk much. I was starting to regret the whole thing, but it felt too late to turn back. As the night went on, I began to notice little things. John kept looking around, almost like he expected to see something. His eyes kept darting into the dark parts of the woods, and his breathing got heavier at times. Every once in a while, he'd just stop and stare into the trees. I couldn't figure it out, but it made me uneasy. I kept wondering why I agreed to come, why I was out here in the middle of nowhere with someone who seemed like he was losing it. Around midnight, John suddenly stood up and walked toward the trees without a word. I watched him go, confused, but didn't follow. I thought he just needed to step away for a minute, but after a few minutes, he still wasn't back. The fire cracked softly, and the night felt too quiet, almost like the world was holding its breath. I waited another 10 minutes, but the weird feeling kept growing. Something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it in the direction John had gone. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were trees and shadows. I called his name a couple of times, but there was no answer. The silence felt like it was closing in on me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I realized I was completely alone. I scanned the area with the flashlight, my hand shaking. That's when I saw it. A shoe. John's shoe, lying on its side just past the trees. I walked over to it, my heart racing faster now. As I got closer, I noticed something else. Faint tracks in the dirt. It looked like something had been dragged. My mind raced, trying to understand what I was seeing. I shined the light deeper into the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of John. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the realization that he was gone. And I had no idea where or how. Fear hit me hard, and I backed away from the trees. I didn't know what had happened, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I quickly gathered my stuff, not caring about what I left behind. All I could think about was getting out of there. I drove through the night, the image of John's shoe stuck in my head. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, and that's when I called for help. The police searched the woods for days, but they didn't find anything. No sign of John, no clues about what had happened to him. It was like he had just disappeared into thin air. Days passed, and the questions only got worse. What had I seen? What had taken him? But no matter how much I thought about it, I knew I would never have the answers. A few months later, I heard someone else had gone missing in that same area. The police never made a connection, but I knew. Something in those woods took John, and whatever it wasn't done. I had always wanted to go camping in the Australian outback. There was just something about the wide open spaces, the endless sky, and the quiet that made me feel free. So when I finally got some time off work, I packed up my stuff and headed out to a spot near Alice Springs. The drive was long, and the sun was burning down hard, but I didn't care. It was what I needed. No people, no noise, just me and the wilderness. After driving for hours, I found a good spot far from the road. I set up my tent and got a small fire going to make some food. As the sun started to set, the sky changed from blue to deep orange. Then it got dark real fast. I had never seen so many stars before. It was amazing, but at the same time, something about it felt too quiet. No birds, no bugs, just a light breeze pushing through the dry bushes. I told myself it was fine. I had camped plenty of times before and nothing had ever gone wrong. Later that night, the air got cold. Fast. The fire kept me warm, but I could feel the chill creeping in from the darkness all around. I added some more wood to the fire and decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, got into my sleeping bag, and shut my eyes. I figured I'd be asleep in no time. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up. It was still pitch black, and the fire outside was just a bunch of glowing embers. Something felt off. I couldn't tell why at first, but I had this heavy feeling, like the air had changed. I stayed still and listened. Nothing, just the wind and maybe some leaves moving in the distance. Then I heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was close. A crunch like someone stepping on gravel. It wasn't fast. It was slow and steady, like someone or something was walking near my tent. My heart started to race. I hadn't seen a single person all day, not even another car on the way here. My mind tried to reason it out. Maybe it was an animal, a kangaroo or something. But the sound, it wasn't like that. It wasn't quick, like animals move. It was slow, like whatever was out there was deliberately walking around my camp. I barely breathed, trying to stay as quiet as I could. The footsteps got closer and then stopped, right outside my tent. I could hear something else too, breathing, but not like an animal. It sounded heavy, labored, like someone struggling to catch their breath. My mind raced, and I felt trapped inside the tent, just a thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was out there. I thought about unzipping it, but the idea of coming face to face with whatever was on the other side froze me in place. Minutes passed, or maybe it was longer, I couldn't tell. Then the footsteps started again. They were moving away slowly. I stayed still, listening, not daring to move. Finally, the sound disappeared into the distance. I waited a long time after that before I even thought about moving. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, just lay there, waiting for the first light of morning. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. Everything looked normal at first, but then I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints, barefoot, circling around my tent, then heading off into the bush. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. Whoever had been out there must have left just before dawn. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast or bother to fully put out the fire. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, my mind kept going back to the footprints. Someone had been out there, walking around my camp in the middle of the night, just watching. But why? And how had they found me all the way out here? The further I drove, the more I felt like I had escaped something I wasn't meant to understand. It wasn't until I got back to the highway that I started to calm down. But even then, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. And I'll never forget what I saw later that day, when I finally stopped at a gas station hours away from where I'd camped. On the local news, there was a story about a missing person. A hiker, last seen near Alice Springs. The picture they showed? Barefoot, just like the footprints I'd seen around my tent. I never camped in the outback again. Something was out there watching me, and if I hadn't woken up when I did, I'm not sure I would have made it out at all. I keep thinking, maybe whoever made those footprints wasn't lost. Maybe they were waiting. I pulled into the clearing as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. It had been a tough year since my ex-wife and I separated, and I thought some time in the woods might help me clear my head. The old forest was the perfect place. I parked my truck, unloaded my gear, and set up camp. As I built the fire, the smell of pine filled the air. The crackling flames brought a warm comfort as night began to fall. I leaned back, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. But as the darkness deepened, an uneasy chill crept over me. The forest felt alive, as if it was watching me. I turned in early, hoping to escape my racing thoughts. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig outside my tent. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but every time I closed my eyes, a nagging fear settled in my stomach. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. Stepping out, I shone the light into the trees, seeing nothing but the thick underbrush. Could have been a branch falling, but something deep inside me felt wrong. I moved closer to the noise, my senses on high alert. The forest felt tense, the air heavy. Suddenly, I heard rustling behind me. I spun around, shining the light everywhere. Nothing, just the dark trees looming over me. After a few minutes, I decided to head back to the tent. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched low behind a tree. My breath caught in my throat. Was someone else camping out here? A wave of adrenaline hit me as I cautiously approached my gear, my mind racing. The figure didn't move. It just stared. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Grabbing my camping axe from the ground, I held it tightly, my heart pounding. I wanted to call out, but I knew I had to face whatever this was. The figure suddenly stood up. I could see it was a man, wild-eyed and dirty, wearing torn clothes. He took a step toward me and my instincts kicked in. I swung the light at him, ordering him to stay back. Fear and anger mixed inside me. Why was he here? He hesitated, raising his hands, and I could see something broken in his eyes. I slowly backed away, keeping the axe ready. My gut screamed at me to run, but I stayed firm, hoping he would just disappear back into the shadows. To my relief, he turned and sprinted into the trees, vanishing into the darkness. I stumbled back to my tent, my heart racing, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on me. The rest of the night was a blur of sounds. The wind whispering, branches creaking, and the unsettling feeling that someone was still out there, watching. When dawn finally broke, I packed my gear as quickly as I could, desperate to leave. As I drove away, I glanced back at the forest, its calm facade hiding the nightmare I had just faced. The peace I sought had turned into a living horror. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't just lost. He was something worse. The woods felt dark, not just from the trees, but from the secrets they held. That day, I learned that some places are better left untouched, and some people can haunt you in ways you never expect. I promised myself never to return, knowing that the forest would always hold the memory of that figure lurking among the trees, waiting for the next unwary traveler. I was a security guard at a remote camping site, responsible for watching over everything at night. The area was surrounded by thick woods, and by the time the sun set, the campers were usually quiet. My job was straightforward: patrol the grounds, check the tents, and make sure everyone was safe. One night, as I walked the path by the lake, I saw a flickering light in the trees. It was odd because no one was supposed to be out there. The camp rules were clear about staying in their tents after dark. I tried to ignore it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check it out. I made my way through the brush, trying to be quiet. The light was dim, but it got brighter as I got closer. It looked like a campfire, but there were no tents nearby. My heart raced as I approached, and I felt a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the cold. Suddenly, the light went out. I froze. In the darkness, I could hear faint rustling, like someone was moving nearby. I called out, but no one answered. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I moved closer to where I had seen the flicker. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the trees. It was hard to see clearly, but it looked like a person hunched over and staring at the ground. I called out again, but there was still no response. A wave of fear washed over me. This was not a camper who got lost. Something was very wrong. I turned to head back to the main campsite, but then I heard a low growl behind me. A wave of terror rushed through me. I started to walk faster, and then I heard footsteps behind me, quickening. I broke into a run, my heart pounding as I raced back along the path. I could hear the figure behind me, getting closer. I didn't dare look back. I finally reached the camp's main area, and relief flooded over me when I saw the bright lights of the camp. I sprinted to the entrance, my pulse racing. Once inside the main lodge, I locked the door and grabbed my radio. My hands were shaking as I reported what I had seen, but deep down, I felt something terrible. They sent a couple of other guards out to check the area, but they found nothing. They told me it was probably just a wild animal or a trick of the light. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept thinking about that figure and wondered if it was just a lost person or something far worse. When morning finally came, I felt somewhat safe as the sunlight flooded the camp. But later, as I patrolled the grounds again, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. A series of footprints leading from the woods to the edge of the lake. They were far too large and deep to belong to any camper. They stopped right at the spot where I had seen the light flickering. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't alone out there. Whatever it was had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I reported it, but deep inside, I knew I wouldn't be able to shake the feeling of being hunted. That night, I decided to stay close to the campfire, staring into the dark woods, knowing they held secrets I might never uncover. As I sat there, I couldn't help but feel eyes on me, lurking just beyond the trees. From then on, I always looked over my shoulder, waiting for that figure to emerge again. And deep down, I understood that the woods would never be silent. They were alive with something sinister, waiting for nightfall, when I would be alone and vulnerable once more. I realized that I was only a visitor in a place where shadows hid something far more dangerous, something that wanted to make me its next prey. I always felt safe in the woods. My grandmother and I had been camping for as long as I could remember. She taught me everything: how to make a fire, how to hang food so animals wouldn't get it, how to tell if it was going to rain by looking at the sky. After she died last year, I hadn't gone camping much. But this weekend, I wanted to feel close to her again. So I went back to one of the spots we loved the most. The place was deep in the woods, far from any paths. It was quiet, cut off from everything, the kind of place where you wouldn't see anyone for miles. That's why we always went there. It felt peaceful, like the rest of the world didn't exist. I thought it would feel good to be back. I set up my tent, made a fire, and sat down to enjoy the evening. The sun was going down, casting long shadows through the trees. It felt good to be there, like my grandmother was somehow still with me. I cooked a simple meal over the fire and then decided to go to bed early. The woods were quiet, and at first it felt calming. But as the night went on, the sounds of the forest started to seem a bit off. I lay in my tent, staring up at the ceiling, trying to ignore the strange feeling building up inside me. Every little rustle, Every snap of a branch seemed louder, closer. I kept telling myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest. I'd heard them all my life, but something didn't feel right. I tried to ignore it, tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. They weren't like the sounds animals make or the wind blowing through the trees. These steps were slow, heavy, and careful. My heart started racing. I froze, lying still, listening as the footsteps circled my campsite. I didn't dare move. The steps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Finally, the steps started up again, moving away, fading into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. When the sun started to rise, I crawled out of my tent, feeling uneasy. There was no sign anyone had been there. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, that it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. I hurried to pack up, eager to leave. But as I bent down to take apart the tent, I saw something that made my stomach twist. On the ground, right where I had been sleeping, there was a deep footprint in the dirt. It wasn't mine, and it was too big to belong to my grandmother. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. That's when I noticed it. The footprint wasn't facing away from the tent. It was facing directly toward it. Whoever or whatever had been there wasn't walking away from me. It had been standing over me, watching. I grabbed my things and ran out of those woods as fast as I could, leaving the rest behind. I never went back, but sometimes I think about that footprint, about how close it was, how I didn't hear it leave, and I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to come back, waiting for me. I work as a ranger, so staying out in the woods overnight is nothing new for me. Over the years, I've gotten used to the loneliness and long hours of walking through the trees. Some of the other rangers joke that the woods have their own way of doing things, that strange stuff happens when you're out there by yourself. I never paid much attention to that. Not until a few weeks ago, anyway. It was a normal camping job. I had to spend a few days deep in the forest, miles from the closest trail. It's one of the more remote areas, barely touched by people, which is why we keep an eye on it. We're supposed to make sure nobody's out there doing anything they shouldn't, like poaching or setting up camps where they don't belong. I got to the spot late in the afternoon and set up my tent right before it got dark. The woods were quiet, just like always. The birds slowly stopped singing as the sun went down, and all that was left was the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I made a small fire, cooked something quick to eat, and sat by the fire for a bit. It was all normal. Around midnight, something woke me up. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but when I really listened, I realized it wasn't. Something was moving around my camp. The sound of leaves crunching came and went, like whatever it was didn't want to be noticed. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, pointing the light out. I didn't see anything. The forest was completely still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I waited and listened for a while, but when I didn't hear anything again, I convinced myself it was just an animal and went back to sleep. The next day went by without any trouble. I checked the area, wrote down what I needed to, and followed my usual routine. That night, I crawled back into my tent, ready for some sleep, hoping nothing would bother me. But something woke me up again. This time it was different. It wasn't just movement. It was breathing, heavy, slow breathing right outside my tent. My heart was pounding as I reached for my flashlight again, trying to stay quiet. I could hear it moving around the tent, each step slow and careful. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like forever. I didn't know if I should unzip the tent and see what it was or just wait it out. The breathing got louder, coming closer to the entrance of my tent. Then it stopped. It was standing right outside, and I could hear every breath it took. Suddenly, the tent shook like something brushed against it. I jumped up, gripping the flashlight so hard my hands hurt, but there was no sound of footsteps moving away. I waited, expecting to hear something else, but everything went completely quiet. I didn't sleep much after that. I stayed awake, listening, my heart racing, until the first light of the morning started creeping through the trees. I packed up as fast as I could, wanting to get out of there. But before I left, I decided to look around the campsite just to see if I could find anything. Maybe tracks or some sign of what had been out there. That's when I saw the footprints. They were big, barefoot prints in the dirt going around my tent. They were deep too, like whatever made them was heavy, much too big to be any animal I knew about in those woods. But what really scared me was that the footprints didn't go anywhere. There were no tracks coming into or leaving the camp. They just circled my tent over and over again, then stopped. It was like whoever made them had just disappeared into thin air. I didn't stick around long after that. I grabbed my gear and got out as fast as I could. But as I left, something strange hit me. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, no sounds at all. It felt like the woods themselves were watching me. That night, after I'd made it back to the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there with me wasn't done. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, about how they started and stopped without a trace. And now, whenever I go out there, I feel it again, that strange, heavy silence, like the forest is waiting for something to happen. I don't know what was out there, but I've never felt the same since. Something changed in those woods that night, and now I always feel like something's watching me from just beyond the trees. It's like whatever made those footprints is still out there, waiting for me to come back. I've always liked camping, especially after long, hard weeks at work as a cop. Being out in nature helps me clear my head. So when I finally got a few days off, I packed my stuff and headed to a campsite I'd heard about. It was way out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick trees, far from any people. That's exactly what I wanted. The first day was normal. I put up my tent, found some firewood, and spent the afternoon walking around. The only sounds were birds, the wind blowing through the leaves, and sometimes the crack of a twig. I cooked some food over the fire and got ready for bed. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. There was no wind, no animal noises, just complete silence. Being a cop, you get a feeling when something isn't right, and I had that feeling. I stayed still, trying to hear anything. Then I caught it, a soft crunching sound, like someone stepping through the woods around me. I sat up fast. It didn't sound like an animal. Animals move randomly, but this was slow, like footsteps. Someone was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly opened the tent, my heart racing. I pointed the light into the trees, but nothing looked out of place. The footsteps stopped. I stood there for what felt like forever, just listening. But there was nothing after that. I told myself it had to be my imagination, so I got back into the tent. Couldn't sleep, though. Every little noise kept me awake. The next morning, I checked around the campsite. I expected to see some tracks or anything out of place, but there was nothing. No sign anyone had been there. The dirt looked untouched. I tried to shake it off and went about my day, but the strange feeling stayed with me. I couldn't get rid of the idea that someone had been watching me. That night, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of footsteps, this time even closer. My flashlight was ready, and I crawled out of the tent. The air felt heavy, like someone was watching me from the trees. I shone the light into the woods, scanning the area. Nothing. But then, just for a second, I saw something. A figure moved between the trees, staying just outside the light. I couldn't get a clear look. They ducked behind a tree before I could really see them. But I knew right then I wasn't alone out there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. The footsteps didn't come back, but I could feel it. Someone was still there, hiding, watching. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As I packed up my things, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched the entire time. When I finally started walking back to my car, I turned around one last time to look at the campsite. That's when I noticed something. In the trees, hidden but visible if you really looked, there were a few small shelters, made of branches and leaves, like little hiding spots. Someone had built them up there. They weren't random, they were placed perfectly to keep an eye on the campsite. Someone had been living out there, watching me the whole time. And then I saw it, right near the spot where my tent had been, fresh footprints. Large ones, too large for any animal. I left quickly after that, but the thought still haunts me. I wasn't just being watched. Someone out there was waiting for me to fall asleep.